All right, good evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. This is your second introduction. My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here, and so glad to see such a great crowd for tonight's program. When we think about notorious drug bosses, who immediately comes to mind? Well, Pablo Escobar, probably, of course, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, perhaps other cartel kingpins such as Carlos Leder and Miguel Felix Gallardo. Then on the domestic front, in America, we have Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes in New York. We got the Flannery brothers in Detroit. That was the subject of a talk a few months ago here. For those with an old school mindset, you might think about Lucky Luciano or Carmine Galante, right? What do all of these individuals have in common? Well, for one thing, they're all men, right? And oftentimes when you're talking about this subject, we're talking about men. But unlike the history of the traditional mob, which consists almost entirely of male, figures at the front of these operations, international drug trafficking has a more diverse history. That diversity is the focus of our program tonight. Very exciting to have our speaker, Deborah Bonello. She is a senior editor focused on Latin America for Vice World News. Throughout her career, she has covered organized crime extensively, contributing to the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, the BBC, and other publications. She also was a senior investigator for Insight Crime think tank, which is an invaluable resource for those of us who study organized crime in the Americas. Deborah's going to provide some great insights into some of the leading women in the underworld of drug trafficking. As usual, we'll take questions after her talk, and we'll bring a microphone around for those who want to ask a question. And start thinking about your questions now, and we'll be ready when she completes her talk. Please welcome Deborah Bonello.
Good evening, everyone. Very excited to be here. As Jeff said, I have been working with Vice for a long time, and as you know, Vice is very specialized in covering crime. I've been in Latin America for about 15 years. You can probably tell I'm not from there or from here. I grew up in the UK. And this work first saw life as a series of stories on Vice called Las Patronas, which is kind of a Latin American Spanish word for the bosses, the female bosses. And I'm currently working on a book of the same title, which is coming out next year. And I'm just getting to the end of writing the manuscript, so I have everything very much in my head. So this picture is from field work that I did for this investigation in Honduras. This dog was trapped in the back garden of a female drug boss who was going through the US justice system. And I went to her tiny little town in Honduras to try and meet people who knew her. And I was going through my field photos for this presentation thinking what best sort of describes my point of view. And it's really a dog trapped behind a door trying to see into a world that I'm not supposed to see. And really, this is kind of as good as it gets when you're covering organized crime. Like, as you all know, if you're narco nerds like I am, they don't really enjoy sharing too much, and neither does law enforcement most of the time. So it's often this sort of very limited crack of vision that you get into the people that you're looking into. And these women, most of the women that I've focused on have been through the US justice system, not all of them, which is honestly kind of how I knew that they even existed. So I don't feel like I have a 100% complete picture of any of them. Only a few of them have spoken to me, some of them by email from prison. I did get lucky enough to meet a few of them in prison as well. But I guess I just felt like this was a good way to give you all the caveat, which is I haven't spent hours speaking to each and every one of them. You know, all of my research is based on field work, speaking to people who knew them. Court transcripts from the US justice system is pure gold in being able to understand, the interactions that went on between them and some of their male protagonists. And before I get started, I just kind of wanted to explain where my research was based. I mean, I think the Mob Museum is very much focused on American organized crime, but as you all know, Colombia and 2 other South American countries are the biggest producers of cocaine in the world. So Central America is really a key transportation hub for cocaine that's being moved from Colombia to the United States. And most of the women who I spoke to were working with the Sinaloa cartel, transporting, helping arrange the logistics for transporting cocaine from Colombia to Mexico and the US. They were laundering money. They were controlling, they're called plazas in Latin America, which is, keeping control of territories that cartels were using to smuggle drugs through. That kind of control is really, really lucrative because you essentially tax criminal organizations to move drugs through your town. So a lot of the women that I spoke to were doing that. And I just wanted you to sort of visualize, that before you even get to the US-Mexico border, there is all this activity and conflict and rivalry going on in Central America, which is, as you all probably know, already a deeply violent place. So I went and did some trips to Honduras and Guatemala. As you can see, a lot of the women were based in border towns, which is where you get that negotiation of power to be able to move cocaine across international borders. So for a lot of them, geography was kind of a defining factor in them getting into the drug trade at all. But first, I wanted to also tell you about my personal motivations for the work, because I am a first-generation immigrant, I suppose. I was born in Malta, and then my parents brought me up in the UK. So I was kind of always an outsider where I was born and always foreign where I was brought up, which always made me kind of take a sort of outsider's view of where I was. And my mum was always trying to get me to wear high heels and makeup, and I was a real tomboy and never wanted to be like the stereotypical girl. I always had dirty, scabby knees and was late for tea and all that kind of stuff. Like, I very much sort of, I suppose, rejected the expectations of teenage girls. And so I've always been really fascinated by women who also kind of work outside of the stereotypes that surround women, which sounds weird nowadays, right? Because we are in this sort of age of emancipation, and you do see a lot of women in fields that are traditionally dominated by men. But I felt like the women in organized crime are still very, very invisible. So when we, as Jeff said, when we think about drug traffickers, we think about Escobar, we think about Chapo Guzman, and guilty as charged, I think the media and cinema has sort of created these myths and these people of legend, and they're always men. And drug traffickers are almost, by definition, male. And I think when I arrived in Mexico in 2006, it was when Calderon, who was the then president, had just launched the drug war. And I say drug war in inverted commas. And organized crime was a part of the general newsbeat right from the beginning for me. And these 2 men were sort of in every single story that we ever wrote about the Mexican drug trade and all the violence that was happening. But I was very struck by how I was one of the few girls covering organized crime, and most of the people who document organized crime are also men. And so I started thinking about whether the reason we didn't see women in organized crime was because there weren't that many women covering organized crime. And so people kept asking me this question, like, is there a female version of Chapo? And to me, that's really not what my work is about, because I feel like Chapo and Escobar, they sort of symbolize these, in Spanish they call them caudillos, these like super strong, dominant, macho men, largely from rural communities. I'm sure you as Americans can envisage the kind of guys that I'm talking about. But if you think about your relationships with your wives and your husbands or your parents' relationships in marriage, I've always felt like, yes, there are overlaps between the way that men and women hold power, but when I look at my parents, who are a long-term traditional Catholic marriage, my mother's power is very different from my father's power, and the way that they not control each other, but influence each other. So I think if we're looking for Chapo, we're by definition looking for male characteristics in women, which do exist, and some of the women that I covered were violent women, but I think we need to have a more sophisticated lens when we're looking at women in organized crime, and sort of get away from those binaries of victim or victimizer, or perceiving power as being defined exclusively by violence. And I think, when we talk about Chapo and Escobar, the first thing we think about are these viscerally violent men who ran viscerally violent organizations. And like the fact of the matter is, most of that violence was outsourced. Like Chapo was not going around doing all the killing himself. And I found that a lot of women had no problem delegating assassinations to other people. They were capable of doing it themselves, and they did. But, this idea that the capacity to physically exert violence on your rivals, to wield power over them, is just not the only framework for women having power in organized crime. So I just want you to kind of think about that as we go through the presentation. Like, we're not looking for... That's not what we're looking for. That's not what I'm talking about, these female versions of capos that we already know. So you might recognize both of these women. That's Griselda Blanco on the left, who is probably the most famous female trafficker, a Colombian woman who was extremely violent and surrounded herself by both men and women who did her bidding. And the woman on the left is from the Narcos Mexico series. Her character is based on Sandra Avila Beltran, who worked for the Sinaloa Cartel. When you go home, Google Sandra Avila Beltran, and you'll see that most of the coverage about her is about her plastic surgery operations, how she loved Botox, who she was sleeping with, the boyfriends of hers that were killed, and a minimization of her sort of political, social, and logistical power within the Sinaloa cartel. I can't actually tell you how powerful she was, because the media coverage of hers is so gendered towards what she was good looking, but that's kind of what all the media coverage tended to focus on about her. And I think there was a tendency to underestimate her. I think she did 7 years of time in the US, and then she did another 10 years in Mexico. I tried to speak to her for this project, and she's done. She doesn't want to speak to anyone anymore. But I sort of feel like she is a really good example of the women we do tend to see in organized crime, which are the pretty ones, the anomalies. And when we look at them and when we're told about them very much from the point of view of their relationship to the men that they were surrounded by, which I believe is a reflection of the male bias in the coverage of organized crime generally, and I'm perfectly willing to go into bat with this if anyone wants to argue with me, but I feel like that's definitely a factor. So this is probably the woman you all know best if you think about cartel queens. This is Chapo Guzman's wife, Emma, who in many ways falls into all the things that I was just talking about. She's pretty, she is adored and idolized in Culiacan, where she's from. She was 32 years Chapo's junior when she met him, and she was a beauty queen. I think she was his third wife. And she was a daily presence at his trial in New York, which was, I think, the mafia trial of my generation, certainly. And she only got 3 years, which is a very short sentence for someone who was married to someone so powerful for such a long time. Criminal lawyers that I spoke to think that the reason that she got such a short sentence was because she cooperated. I mean, she was in very close contact with Chapo's 3 sons, who have now taken the reins of the Sinaloa cartel, as well as Ismael Mayo Zambada, who is the currently only free Sinaloa cartel leader of legend left. So I expect she had quite a lot to share with prosecutors, and that's probably why she only got 3 years. But she's also far from the most powerful woman in the Sinaloa cartel. I would argue that this woman is the most powerful woman in the Sinaloa cartel. She was arrested a month after Chapo and sent to Chicago. Again, Google her. You'll see about 15 headlines about her in total. She pleaded guilty and cooperated. But if you look at her charge sheet, it's kind of astonishing. I mean, she worked with Chapo's son Alfredillo, Jesus. She was intrinsically involved in all of the logistics, from getting drugs from Mexico to the US, and then getting the profits from the drugs back into Mexico. She helped grease the palms of all the officials that you need to grease the palms of to make that happen. And she was also very much involved in acquiring weaponry for the cartels in the US and moving those into Mexico, which, as you all know, is pretty easy these days. And yeah, she got a very light sentence considering her role. This woman, on the other hand, got 27 years in prison. Her story is fascinating. She is from rural Sinaloa, and she was arrested in Colombia, I expect on business. She studied law. I managed to track her father down in Sinaloa. She studied law. She was not from a particularly poor family. She did business with her 2 sons and her daughter. They ran cocaine from Colombia all the way through Central America to the US. She was arrested in Colombia in April 2017. A few days after she was arrested, her sons were picked up in Sonora, Mexico, tortured, left in their vehicle, set on fire alive, and after the vehicle had stopped burning, their heads were removed. After she found out about that, she was already in custody by then. I was told by people close to her case that she kind of went to pieces, and she felt that the murder of her sons was a direct message from the Sinaloa cartel, who she worked with, to stay quiet in custody. Because the first thing that the cartel worries about if a powerful leader is taken to the States is that she is going to tell them all their company secrets. As a result of that, she ended up pleading innocent, and she went to trial. And a trial is really, I mean, I'm sure you all know how the US justice system works, but if you plead guilty and you take a plea, everything stays behind closed doors. So your dirty laundry is not aired, your criminal conspirators are not put on the stand to talk about all the stuff that you've done. And that was not the case for her. And much like the Guzman case, most of the witnesses in her case were traffickers themselves, as DEA informants usually are. Which, for me, you know, it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? You kind of need people inside the trade to tell you what's going on and what these people are doing. But then on the other hand, you're like, well, how far can you trust the drug trafficker? Because lying is kind of part of the business. So there were a lot of people who incriminated her and said that she was the female face of the Sinaloa cartel and had Guzman on speed dial. I just don't know. She denied that. She didn't testify in her trial, and she just made a statement to the judge before they sentenced her. But 27 years is a very, very heavy sentence. I mean, 22 there, but she's already been in custody since 2017. But she was fascinating, and most of the case was based on wiretaps as well as informants. And what was interesting was there was not a touch of violence to any of her communications. So there were a number of incidents that were caught on wiretap where contacts of hers lost drug seizures in the US. You know, they were doing deals, and then the police came and they like seized a lot of meth and coke, which, if you're a middleman dealer, is bad news, because your source suppliers can have you killed for that kind of thing, or suspect that you're robbing them. But in her communications with the people who that happened to, she was never un hija de puta. So I don't know how to say that in English, but like, she was never a son of a bitch about it. She was always very non-threatening. She was never heavy with the people that she spoke to about those things, which for me is super interesting, because we have sort of grown up with this idea that violence is such a necessary part of doing business in the drug trade. Whether she depended on the Sinaloa cartel to do the violence for her, I really don't know. And there were no violent charges against her. She was only taken down for drug trafficking. But it is an interesting, hers was an interesting model, and sort of got me thinking about really how necessary it is as a woman to be able to manage violence. I don't know whether it's an absolute essential. Marixa Lemus Perez was based on the Guatemala-El Salvador border. Now, she was a very violent woman. She was initially incarcerated for murdering her own husband. That was her second husband. Her first husband also died under suspicious circumstances, but she's never been formally charged. But she came from a family, a political family, from Moyuta, which is basically where Guatemala meets El Salvador, and that's a big cocaine corridor for cocaine coming up from Colombia on its way to the US. So controlling that part of the border and that small town is a very lucrative business, which is why you have so many. She was running for political office at the time that she was also mixing with the nefarious narcos. And she was eventually jailed, and I did actually manage to get into a Guatemalan prison to meet her. I think because she's not very high profile, as none of these women are. And the Central American prison system is permeable if you know the right people. So I did get to sit down with her for half an hour, and she was, I mean, one of the tensions of this book is I don't want to be seen to be glorifying women who have become empowered in violent environments, but at the same time, like, I couldn't help but by being impressed by her, because she was very self-possessed. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was in solitary confinement. She wasn't seeing a lot of people. You know, I remember her coming up into the room that we met, and she was blinking like she hadn't seen light for a while. Her daughter was killed in the violence around her family. And she'd lived a lot, she'd suffered a lot. She seemed like a real hard ass, and she was very open about the fact that she was a violent person. Her sister was even more violent than she was, but was killed in a shootout in the town a few years before when she was running for mayor. But she was a real character, and all she wants to do is get out of prison to go essentially kill her political rival in her town, take power, and he, the local mayor, is terrified of her. So yeah, she was super fascinating, and she's been given the moniker of the female Chapo of Guatemala because she's escaped from prison twice already, which is why her nemesis back home is so fearful of her. Apparently, when she escaped the first time, he didn't want to leave his house until she'd been recaptured. So there was true fear. You know, she did sort of strike fear into people. This is actually video I took on the border town where she lives. These container trucks are coming in and out of her town all the time. And so they go from El Salvador to Guatemala packed with hidden cocaine and methamphetamine. And then when they cross back over the border, they're usually packed with cash that's hidden underneath the container trucks. They all have like secret compartments. And this kind of constant flow of container traffic was what made this part of Central America so lucrative to control, because you can stop those trucks from getting through the border if you want to. And those trucks would go right past the restaurant where her sister was killed. I'm not going to go through all the women, but Digna is the reason that I got interested in this project in the first place. She's a 65-year-old matriarch from Honduras. She was arrested in Miami in 2013 and brought down her entire family clan, which was based on the Honduras-Guatemala border. I went to her tiny town of El Espiritu. It's about a 3,000 people town, tiny. It had a cathedral, a church, a Catholic church the size of this museum in this tiny town that her and her family helped build. And what you often see in Latin America is the cartel sort of fill the void where the state should be. So they create these public services and they build these beautiful churches and they pave the streets and they give the police trucks that work and fill their trucks with gas because the government doesn't or won't. So her family was sort of these loved benefactors for a while. They were transporters for the Colombian cartels. So they would send coke over the border into Guatemala on its way to Mexico, making about $800,000 per ton that was shipped through. So it was very lucrative. After the Valle cartel was brought down, they found $11 million buried in water tanks around their pueblo. Like, they were making so much money that they didn't know what to do with it. And Digna was the oldest of the family, the oldest of 13 siblings, very much a matriarch. And, you might not be aware, but the president of Honduras is currently facing trial in New York for drug trafficking. The president was working with Digna's family and Chapo Guzman to move cocaine through Honduras to Mexico. So she was incredibly powerful, and her arrest basically was the domino that set all the other dominoes falling. And I was just really struck by how important she was, and yet how invisible she was. So this is the church that the Valles built. You can see her name is embossed on the bench outside the church. And this tiny town was littered with these narco mansions of her and her brothers. They built these oversized houses that dwarfed all the sort of normal people's houses. And depending on who you spoke to, I ended up sitting in Digna's neighbor's front room, who turned out to be her best friends and loved her and talked about what great taste she had in church fittings and all that kind of stuff. And then they were like, oh, you want to speak to Digna? And Digna at the time had just gotten out of jail in the US and was sitting in Houston facing possible deportation. Someone comes out of the house with her on video phone. So suddenly I'm face to face with Digna, who's already said no to me 3 times for an interview. And I figured didn't realize that I was the person who had been annoying her for an interview. And I had gone to her town with the local bishop because the narcos do still love the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church do still love the narcos. And so if I was with the bishop, I was kind of all right under their terms. And I think when she saw me sitting in her front room with the bishop, she was like, oh, okay, she's non-threatening. But that was definitely a moment. And then this is, I think, the last woman I'll tell you about, Marllory Chacon Rossell, who was at one point the most prolific drug trafficker in Central America. I mean, this woman was moving about $10 million a month in the region. She was working with all the major male mafia across Guatemala and Mexico. And in the end, she was very well educated. She studied psychology. She had legitimate businesses before she got into the drug trade. She was very, she was glamorous, middle class. She didn't get into it because she really didn't have anything else to do. Like, that was what she wanted to do. And her husband was a money launderer, apparently not a very good one because he got incarcerated, and his Colombian contacts asked her to take his place, and she excelled. To such a point that the DEA sanctioned her, so she turned informant and brought down a whole slew of other people with her. And if you Google, I can't remember, there's a French magazine, it's the equivalent of Hello magazine. Her daughter has a little fashion empire in France now. They're a very sophisticated pair. Marjorie's trying to get residency in the US and get a green card, so sadly she wouldn't speak to me because apparently immigration judges don't look very kindly on narcos sort of talking about their past if they want to stay in the US. But she's a fascinating case, too, of someone who could have done a lot of other things, and this is another part of the investigation that I find super interesting, is I think we assume that women are sort of dragged kicking and screaming into the drug trade by their errant husbands. And I remember speaking to a woman in a prison in Guatemala once who had run a kidnapping ring, and I didn't realize who she was. And I said, well, how did you get into it? She was serving a 50-year sentence in Guatemala for kidnapping. And she told me her husband had been a narco, and then he died, and someone had approached her and said, do you want to get into this? It was when kidnapping was booming in Guatemala. And I was like, well, why did you do that? What did you do it for? And she was like, oh, I had plenty of money. Like, when he died, he left me all this money. And she was like, I wanted to know what it felt like to put my life at risk. She said, I wanted to get the adrenaline, and I wanted to be the boss of this kidnapping ring. And when I got out of prison and Googled her, sure enough, like the FBI, she was working in Guatemala, the FBI got involved because they kidnapped an American citizen, and she was the boss of the kidnapping ring. And by the time I met her, she'd already done 20 years. But she was very honest about it, and I was like, why do we assume that women only do bad things because they feel like they don't have any choice? I think there is still this belief that criminal intent is somehow gendered, and it is the men who make us bad. We can't be bad ourselves. And I think that's absolutely not the case. And I just wanted to talk a little bit too about how the presence of the drug trade, especially in Mexico, has such a big impact on women as well. This is a photo I took when I was on a field trip. I met a man who taught Emma Coronel how to fire a gun, because after Chapo was sentenced, she became very fearful for her life, and I think it's why she essentially decided to come to the US and hand herself in. Because with Chapo away for life, she just wasn't sure that she would make it, and they have twin daughters, and I think she was like, I do want to live a long life. So anyway, my friend taught her how to shoot, and he runs a course for women who want to shoot. And so many women on the course sort of look like this, which is sort of Emma Coronel on steroids. They're called buchonas, which is sort of local slang for narco wife or narco girlfriend. When I write about it, I sort of describe it as kind of a white Kim Kardashian on steroids. And Culiacan is sort of the plastic surgery capital for women who want the look, They'll take out a couple of ribs, bring in your waist, pump up your pompies and the boobs, and everyone has the same sort of nose, the operated nose. This also happens where you have a 15-year-old kid posing with an Uzi on TikTok because she thinks it's cool to pose with an Uzi on TikTok because she sees other kids posing with Uzis on TikTok. And then the Uzi goes off, But there is a very strong aspirational culture that's being disseminated on social media in Culiacan that, women like Coronel and Marixa and all the women I've talked about are sort of, and the men too, are idolized as these kind of Robin Hood-esque rags to riches stories. Because there isn't very much social mobility in Latin America, meritocracy is not really a thing. So you can sort of try as hard as you like and not really get anywhere. So I think they see people like Chapo, who started off as a impoverished farmer in rural Sinaloa and then got on the Forbes most, he's a success story for them. And to aspire to that is super common, sadly, because it does have a detrimental effect on sort of youth culture. And with these kinds of women who are getting operated on, I'm working on a story right now about there's sort of this shadow plastic surgery industry. So if you want to get this look, you're looking at about $6,000 or $7,000 for the basic lipo thing. But if you're a working class girl and you can't afford that, you can sort of put your name in a hat and pay a lot less. But what's happening is a lot of girls are dying after those kinds of surgeries because it's perforating organs, and the doctors who are doing them are actually dentists. But they sort of so desperately want to look like that, they're willing to take the risk. And I just want to finish with this woman who was arrested like maybe 3 weeks ago. Again, in Honduras, again, she looks like a grandmother. Again, she led a family-based drug trafficking ring with her sons. I think she's in her mid-60s. The point being that the more you look, or the more I look for these women, they're everywhere. And I think this is not new. I don't think that because of the sort of, emancipation of women that we've seen in the last, century and a half, I don't think that this has happened just because I've started doing this research. I think these women have been there for a really, really long time, but that we haven't seen them because we're not looking for them. And why aren't we looking for them? Because we're looking for men when we think about drug traffickers. And so I think we need to be aware that you really can't stereotype women in the drug trade. And I keep seeing these criminology studies that are like, oh, well, women only launder money, or women only do this and that, and it's just not true. I've seen them as killers, as money launderers, as logistical heads. They are present at all levels of the drug trade, and as we've shown in the hierarchy too. And yes, some of them do come into the trade because of their relationships with men in their family, be that blood ties or marriage, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them get involved because they want to. So it's all to say that I feel like this work has just been such an eye-opener in terms of the lenses that we have into the world and the expectations that we have, and how we often see what we want to see. But actually, I think with women, I certainly feel like we can't know enough about the way that they have been integrated into organized crime. And it's just fascinating. I mean, I could talk about this forever, but I'll leave it there in case there are any questions. But yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Excellent and very new information for a lot of us,
Good.
really. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. We can start here.
Hi, thank you very much. Super interesting.
Good.
One thing you highlighted was one in particular where she worked with her sons and her sons were killed. What about younger children and whether or not these, wives or bosses, female bosses, have ever thought of the implications of younger children, or did they wait until they were older to get involved? Based on your interviews, have you seen a trend with that, or have they been involved with adults once their children are adults?
I mean, most of the women I covered, now that you ask, were in their 50s or 60s. But most of them were also grandmothers, like Luz, who I talked about. In her communications with her clients who she was selling cocaine to, she would send pictures of her grandchildren to them. And they would compare that. She would talk about her children with the people that she was doing business with. And I think, as far as she's concerned, one of the reasons she actually did decide to plead innocent and go to trial was because she wanted to protect the other members of her family, who all remain in Culiacan to this day. So they killed her adult sons, but her adult sons, I have no doubt, had a plethora of children, as does her daughter. Her father and her sister still live in Culiacan. So, I mean, I see what you're saying, right? It's like, we all know what the drug trade's like, you know what you're getting yourself into. I never saw women with very young children involved. I did see a trend where women were sort of older, but I mean, I think as much as, I'm glad you asked that question, because if you think about male drug traffickers, they all have millions of children. And no one would ever question Chapo's capacities as a father because he got into the drug trade. And so sometimes you see this Narco Mami moniker, which is for Enedina Arellano Felix, for example, who controlled Tijuana for a while. They used to call her the Narco Mami in Mexico because she was a mom. And I'm like, would you ever call Chapo a Narco Papi? I mean, I've never seen it. But again, it's like those judgments of society, right? Like if you're a guy with kids, who cares if you're a drug trafficker? You're not violating your fatherly roles. Whereas as a woman, if you have children and you get into the drug trade, it's even more threatening, right? Because you should really be thinking of your children first. But it's a really interesting part of the way we perceive wrongdoing and culpability and agency, I think.
All right, raise your hands again, please. There's one.
Really terrific. Can you explain a little bit about what the drug trafficking nature of what these women did at the border? Were they involved in the truck driving? They just allowed? Like, I'm a little confused of what their business operation was kind of like, what they did, and how were they compensated?
So
what type of compensation would they get?
Marixa, who was the woman I showed you, she's the youngest woman. She has long black hair. I met her in prison. She came from a family that had held political office in Moyuta, which is on the Guatemala-El Salvador border, for quite a few years. So her brother was mayor, and then her sister was running for mayor. But what you find is mayors, even though they're elected officials, they're essentially narcos in those border towns. So you, as the local sheriff, decides who comes in and out, who runs what trucks, and you pay the local sheriff to do that. So if you're a local powerful politician, which her family was, she was running for political office against her nemesis, who was terrified of her, and she said actually had her incarcerated, but I don't think he killed her husband, I think she did. But that was how you made your money. The people who are moving cocaine, the cartels, pay a tax to move through your territory. So being able to control that territory is super important. There was another woman, actually, who I didn't talk about just because I didn't want to kind of drone on too much, but she's actually on the opening card. Her name was Sebastiana Coton. She was based on this woman here in the blue. I mean, look at her. I wouldn't really want to annoy her, would you? She was based on Guatemala's border with Mexico, and she was a transporter for the Sinaloa cartel. So her family would essentially, you send your cocaine up, and she escorts it and makes sure that it gets across the border. And she'll store it in her warehouses for you if you need to wait to move it over into Mexico, which all sound like simple logistics, right? If it was bread or jam or, I don't know, eggs, but we're talking about a high value illegal product, and every moment of its existence on that trail is risk to the people who own it. So the people that they trust to transport their cocaine are very, very important people. And she was the person who was essentially babysitting that cocaine when it came into her territory until it got into the hands of the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. So those were the sorts of jobs they did. But like Marllory Chacon, who was the glamour girl, her main thing was actually once the drugs had been sold in the US and you're generating millions of dollars, it's like, how do I move that value into Mexico or Latin America without raising suspicions of law enforcement? And like I said, the Valles had $11 million buried in the backyard because they just didn't know what to do with that much cash. And so she understood how to move that cash south without raising suspicions. Clearly not that well because she got taken down eventually, but that was her role. She would hide that money in cars or contraband cigarettes or all the different ways that the cartels used to launder money to move value across borders. That was kind of her thing.
One time a DEA agent told me drug trafficking is 95% logistics. Right? If you have experts in logistics, you're going to have a successful trafficking operation. Here's another one. Go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. I think you're very brave, and journalists are very courageous people, especially when they're basically war correspondents. Did you feel threatened when you were down there? I mean, you were moving across all of these borders in remote locations. You're talking to pretty nasty people. How did you keep yourself safe? Did you feel scared?
Well, The short answer is I never do any assignment that I don't think I'll come back from. Maybe I've sort of gotten over myself now. I have 2 kids. I have no interest in being that journalist. But yes, there was an element of risk. I did a lot of desk work. You know, there was a lot of trawling through court documents, phone calls, agents, and law enforcement people, and family members, and people reaching out on social media who said that they knew these women. And I'd be like, do you? I don't know. But a lot of the trip was because, yeah, I had so little access to them. I really wanted to get a sense of what they were like. And actually, I have to shout out to Vice on that, because the trip I made to Central America to meet some of the women, like, that blue line is kind of where the whole trip that I made. And the Guatemala-Honduras border is one of the most dangerous parts of Latin America. I mean, there's really no state presence whatsoever. You have a huge amount of drugs moving over the border, as well as contraband. And Vice has a security team. I went, you know, I'm on first name basis, first name terms with my security man. I called him several times, having freakouts. I mean, like I said, when we got to Digna's town, which is the top square, and I ended up on the phone to her, I really didn't expect that to happen. The reason I had gone to El Espiritu in the first place was because she refused to speak to me. And so, yeah, I did feel like a lamb amongst the wolves, because I knew that I was speaking to her next-door neighbors, who were speaking very highly of her, which probably meant that they worked with her in some capacity. I had convinced the local bishop to come with me to El Espiritu because I knew how much these families esteem the church, and it was very contrived on my part. Like, I wasn't going to go alone. I was also working with a local driver and fixer. The driver was a former law enforcement official. He was quite out of shape, quite honestly. I don't think he would have been that useful in an emergency situation, but he could hostile drive and like all the things that might be necessary to get out of a tight fix. But, you know, he like charges $700 a day. Like, there was no way I was going to be able to do that as a freelancer. And Vice financed that whole thing. I also got a grant from the International Women's Media Fund, which was how I funded a lot of that reporting as well. But yeah, there was that moment sitting in that front room when the woman came out and Digna was on video phone, and I was like, fuck. And I remember looking back at my driver, and he was looking at me. And we were being like, is she going to figure out that you're that annoying journalist who's been trying to speak to her for 2 years? But, I mean, they gave us lunch. Like, they were so friendly. And she was very affable on the phone. I mean, she was a bit discombobulated, you know. She seemed disorientated. She'd just come out of prison. They tried to deport her. She managed to stave it off. If they had sent her back to Honduras, she surely would have been assassinated. Because at the time, the president who was in power was the president who had helped her traffic drugs, and he knew full well that she'd been telling the Americans about it. And then, when I left El Espiritu and I wrote about Digna, I spoke to asylum seekers in the US who had fled that tiny town in Honduras, who told me that she was sending out hits on people. And that her brothers were essentially Vikings who would abduct 12-year-old girls, take them to their mansions, rape them, let the security guys rape them, send them home to their families, and forbid them from reporting them to the police. And Digna was fully aware of what was happening, did nothing to stop it, and was also sending out armed trucks to people's houses to kill families who knew too much. Now, asylum seekers are going to tell me that, right? Because they don't want to go back to Honduras. They already know the Valle family's name is in the dirt. And the way that I wrote the story was, look, this is what this group of people told me. The people who had welcomed me into their homes in Honduras were pissed when the piece came out, and they saw that. And I felt that didn't make me feel good, because I felt like they'd been really sweet to me and they'd been open but that's the thing about journalism, like, you kind of have to accept not being liked. It's not the point of the exercise. But when I do remember getting a message from them after that piece came out, and I could see how pissed they were. And I was on the way to pick up my kid from school, and I had this kind of cold sweat going down. And then I was like, no, she's out of the game. She doesn't have her finger on the button anymore. Like, and she had already been convicted for drug trafficking. I wasn't pointing the finger at someone who no one knew was a drug trafficker. Do you see what I mean? I just kind of expanded on her life. And actually, Marixa, the woman in the Guatemalan prison, Facebook called me a few times after I had visited her in prison, because I told her I was writing a book. And I didn't pick up any of the calls because I was worried that Guatemalan law enforcement are monitoring who she's speaking to, and even answering her could be seen as, I mean, how she got hold of Facebook in solitary confinement, I don't know, but she did. And I was scared then because I also did not want to be perceived as having anything but, you know, a kind of journalistic relationship with her, and I didn't want her following up with me. And I want to travel again in Guatemala. I don't want to go there and be suspected of working with Lemus Perez, you know, who's kind of a household name there. So yeah, I mean, but the thing is, I have to say, I always felt like I was very diligent about preparing for trips. The security team always put me through my paces about what if this happens, what if that happens. You know, I had a tracker, I had a big team. I always work with locals wherever I go, even if it's in Mexico to Culiacan. I never go on my own because my Spanish is very good, but I still miss nuances. I don't look Mexican. You know, I'm totally cautious. Like I'm not going in there without preparation, and I won't go in there if I don't think that things are going to go my way. I was in Culiacan recently. I wanted to go and visit some female poppy farmers because I feel like we never really hear from female poppy farmers. And the guy who was going to take me, I had never worked with before, and has a reputation of, he's a narco corrido singer. He like sings songs that are dedicated to drug traffickers, and he kind of does fixing on the side for journalists. And he was like, oh, we're going to go up there, and then we're going to stay the night. And I'm like, well, where are we going to sleep? And like, is it just going to be me and you? And like, the whole thing just sounded off, and I just didn't go because I felt like I can see us in the middle of, you know, the Golden Triangle, 2 o'clock in the morning, and he decides to call up some of his mates, and they come round, and then, do you know what I mean? Like, I just felt like I would have absolutely no control of the situation, and decided that it wasn't worth the risk. I will do that trip. I think I'll do it with somebody else. But I do always have to feel like there are always some variables and uncertainties, like meeting Digna on video phone, but it worked to my advantage. Like, it really made the story better. But I try and eliminate as much, you know, I try not to have to take too many chances. So I do always do my homework before I go anywhere. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it is scary. And like, I have spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what that text message meant. And,
we can take maybe one more, or maybe 1 or 2 more. Here's one in the front. Yeah. 2 of them total. The one behind you first.
Hi, very interesting. Thank you. Real quick, using your words, these ladies are out of the game, but I want to know, are there any new ladies coming into the game?
I have absolutely no doubt that there are as many women, or if not more, who I haven't even discovered yet. Most of these women I only know about because they went through the US justice system, which is beautiful because it has a paper trail, and you can look up documents that tell you about charges and conversations in court and sentencing and all these things that have such a wealth of information about people. And so these women, you know, they were in the justice system. Their process started years ago. And the reason I know about them today is because all of that documentation has come out. So I have no doubt that there are more and more women in the system that will come to light. But I think that for every woman who does end up in the hands of law enforcement, there are dozens that don't, but they're invisible. So it's really hard to know who they are and what they're doing. Because for some reason, they don't become the stuff of legend the way that men do. Why that is Anybody's guess?
We have one
Yes,
more
exactly.
question in the front. We'll wrap it up here.
You spent most of your time in Central America. Yet, of course, Sinaloa is a Mexican state. And I noticed the only one you have up there is Tapachula and Huehuetenango. I'm wondering, this was the main entrance area from Central America into Mexico?
Tapachula?
Tapachula,
Yeah.
in Chiapas.
And Chiapas, yeah. But the reason I didn't do too much research in Culiacan is because both of the women that I was focused on are very contemporary. And the Chapo's sons worked with both of them. And so I did go and ask questions about them, but no one wanted to speak about them because no one wants to be perceived as talking about the Chapitos business, because the Chapitos are totally in control in Culiacan, and they have a reputation as being very violent millennials. So it was very difficult to do research in Mexico about my particular women. I did manage to find Luz's father, and he confirmed some things, but he just wouldn't go there. Like, it's too recent, it's too contemporary, and there are still so many players in the game. Those women are still very fresh, so no one really wanted to be seen as talking to a journalist about them. I have no doubt that as soon as I land in Culiacan, they know, and they know when you leave. You know, it's that kind of town. It's like very much under their control. So I was pretty cautious about it. And you know, I kind of focused on the women I knew I would be able to have access to information about. You know, I mean, with Luz, the woman, literally all her court transcripts became public a month ago, and that's why she's a big part of the book. But I didn't know whether that was going to happen because I didn't really know anything about her until then. It was very, you know, you have like the indictment and that's it. So the women I focused on was very much dependent on how much information was available to me or whether I could meet them, in the case of Marixa, because I did meet her. So I had to make those calls too. I don't doubt that there are dozens more, but they stay under the radar. So.
You had one more question?
Thank
Go
you
ahead.
very much, and I want to say I'm glad you stayed safe.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Well, thank you all for coming, and please a big round of applause for Deborah Bonello.